Hello, scholars. Here we are at lesson number 2 of the creation of the United States Constitution. This is a follow up to our work on lesson 1, where we were first hearing about the states needing to create their own state constitutions, and then the United States worked to create a central government, remember, called the Articles of Confederation. After 6 years of the United States running under the Articles of Confederation, at the end of our last study, we learned that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention decided they wanted to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, and create a whole new government for the United States. That's where we pick up on things today. So, in our work today, we will learn about the creation of a central government to replace the Articles of Confederation, and we will learn about three major compromises at the Constitutional Convention. Now, before we jump into that, do you know what a compromise is? Right? A compromise is when each side gives up a little bit of what it wants, right, to kind of meet in the middle, a decision that they're okay with, but not getting completely what they want. Right? Maybe you've had to compromise with your family on something. Right? You want something, your parents or family member wants a different thing, and you figure out kind of a compromise of how you each get part of what you want. Right? That's a compromise. So, three major big compromises that happen at this convention. Ready to get started? Here we go. So, the Constitutional Convention delegates are meeting. They have some big decisions that they need to make about the new form of government for the United States. They realize, right, after the Articles of Confederation, that they need a stronger central government. Right? The Articles of Confederation, the central government, the government for the whole United States, was too weak. It did not have enough power. Remember, it could not tax the people, it could not declare war, it could not set up a system of mail delivery for the whole United States. So, some things that needed to be taken care of. After much talking, it was finally decided that the new government would have three branches of government that would separate the powers, right? Remember, scholars, they're now broken away from Great Britain, where they were seeing a king and parliament as having too much power. They wanted to create something where the power was balanced between different groups of people or different people so that no one had too much power. They were separating that power out to different groups. So, the decision was to have three branches of government. One of those branches is the legislative branch, which is Congress. Congress works to make the laws. The second branch, the executive branch. The executive branch is the president and his or her cabinet members, advisors, and they work to carry out the laws that have been passed by the legislative branch. And thirdly is the judicial branch. The judicial branch is made up of the federal courts and the Supreme Court of the United States. It decides cases involving the laws and the Constitution. Here's a poster showing those separation of powers. The legislative branch, right? Congress, which you can see there is divided into two houses, two groups. We'll get to that in a moment. The executive branch, right? The president and vice president and his or her cabinet members, right? Advisors. And the judicial branch does have federal courts, and then ultimately the Supreme Court of the United States, which currently has 9 justices or judges serving on it. Now, scholars, as we're looking at these 3 branches of government, let me quickly tell you a little bit about how they separate the powers. So, the legislative branch, right, working to make the laws. So, it's not yet a law as the legislative branch is working on it, but let's say they want to pass a law that everyone has to have purple trash cans. They vote on it, and the majority of the members of Congress vote in favor of it. Yes, supporting the idea of everyone having purple trash cans. After that vote is declared, they send that bill to the president, that document. If the president signs that, agreeing to it, then he or she signs that bill into law. Again, if he or she agrees, signs it, it becomes a law. Now, if the president gets that bill, right, that Congress wants to be a law, and disagrees with it, he or she can veto it or say no to it and not sign that bill. It then does not become a law. Now, scholars, that might sound like a lot of power for the president. But once the president, if the president decides not to sign it, right, to veto it, it can go back to Congress. And if enough members of Congress, 2/3 of them, want to still work on that, they can what's called override the veto. If enough of them agree, they can override that presidential veto and still make it a law. Now, let's imagine for a moment the president and Congress agree on this idea, and the president signs that bill saying, yes, I think everyone should have a purple trash can. This now is how the judicial branch gets involved. It becomes a law, but then there's some citizens in the United States who say, this seems to infringe upon my freedom to have a different color trash can if I would like. So they sue, saying that they do not think it is constitutional, meaning that it can be a law to require everyone to have a certain color trash can. The court could then listen to that argument, and then the court will decide, right, is this constitutional or not? Does this law fit inside the framework of the Constitution of the United States? Right? Is it within the realm of the government to tell people what color garbage can they have to have? Now, the Supreme Court could agree with this law and say, yep, it is constitutional. Or they could say, this does not fit in our Constitution. We should not be telling people what color garbage can to have. And they could declare the law unconstitutional, which then makes it no longer a law. So that's an example, right, of how the power is separated, how each of these branches of government can check and balance the power of the other branches of government. Now, there's quite a bit more to that, and you'll study it in a little more detail in 4th grade, but that gives you a little sense of how these 3 branches of government under this newly formed Constitution work in the United States. Now, once they decided on these 3 branches of government, there were 3 big and rather famous compromises that had to take place at this convention. You'll want to listen closely to these because they're very big deals. The first compromise related to representation in Congress. Let me explain. So, states with large population wanted representation to be based on population because then they would have more votes in Congress. But states with smaller populations wanted representation to be based on the same number for each state. Since they had less people, they didn't think it was fair or equal, perhaps, to base representation only on the population, right? At that time, remember, there were 13 states. There were many more people living in Massachusetts, for example, than in maybe South Carolina, right? So states that had a lot of people wanted representation, right? How many members of Congress you would have to be based on how many people lived in your state. But if your state didn't have very many people living in it, right, you didn't want your representation in Congress to be based on that because it meant you would get less votes. So, scholars, how in the world do you compromise on that? If some states want it to be based on population and some states do not want it to be based on population, how do you compromise? Well, the compromise was to create two separate houses in Congress. The House of Representatives will be based on the population, and the Senate will be based on each state getting the same number of votes. So each state, right, got a little bit of what it wanted. So let me back up just a quick moment, everyone. Right, if we go back to this map, right, the House of Representatives, right, see that in Congress where it's split into two? So all the members of the House of Representatives, how many delegates or representatives you have in that house, in that branch of Congress, is based on how many people live in your state. In the Senate, however, the other House of Congress, every state has the same number there. So let me tell you what that means. By the way, this became known as the Great Compromise. This is still our United States Congress of today. So in the Senate, each state has two senators representing the people of that state. No matter what the population of the state is, that state has two senators. That is a total of 100 senators, right? 50 states, two from each state. So, for example, scholars, right? North Dakota, which has many less people than, let's say, California, they both still have two senators in the Senate. It does not matter what the population is in your state. It does not matter how many people live there. Every state has two senators in the Senate. Now, the House of Representatives, on the other hand, each state has representatives based on the population, how many people live in that state. So, examples: Minnesota has 8 representatives, North Dakota has 1 representative, California has 53 representatives, Texas has 36 representatives, Rhode Island has 2 representatives. So, how many representatives you have in the House of Representatives depends on how many people live in your state. So, looking at this, you can tell, right, North Dakota has many, many fewer people than California because North Dakota has 1 rep. California has 53 of them. So, all the states together, based on that population, there are 435 representatives in the House of Representatives in the United States Congress. That's this compromise in action. Now, let's get to the second compromise: counting enslaved people. Now that they had created these two houses of Congress, right, Southern states wanted to count their enslaved people as part of the population because it would give them more votes in the House of Representatives. The northern states, even though they were against slavery, said enslaved people should not count because the South was calling them property and not people, right? And the North was saying this because they didn't want the South to have more votes in Congress. So again, how do you compromise on this? Right? The southern states want to count their enslaved people so they have more representatives, and the North is saying, "No, we don't want you to do that." How do you compromise on that? Well, after much debate about it, their compromise became that every 5 enslaved people would count as 3 people. Let's think about that for a moment. Every 5 people who are enslaved will actually only count as 3 in the population. This compromise became known as the 3/5 compromise, right? Saying 3 of or 5 of every 3 people will be counted. Well, sorry, every 5 people will count as 3. Let me show you that in a little picture. So here's a look at what that 3/5 compromise would be. So the 10 enslaved people shown here would actually only count as being 6 people in your population. I want you to imagine that for a moment. Imagine not being valued enough to be counted as a whole person. Right? When we look at this, scholars, we would say there are 10 people here. But this compromise was saying, oh no, each of these people you see isn't really a whole person. 5 of them together will count as being 3 people. Imagine not being valued enough to be counted as a person. Wow. That means, scholars, in a classroom of 25 people, that would only count as being 15 people instead of the actual 25 of them. Right? Imagine that. Walking into a room, seeing 25 students working, but saying, oh, the value of this room is really only 15, even though there's 25 of us in the room. That brings us then to the third compromise, which again relates to enslaved people. But this time it related to importing, bringing in enslaved people from Africa and the West Indies. The northern states, as this government was being created, wanted to stop any more enslaved Africans from being brought into the United States. Right? Remember, those northern states have now banned slavery in their states. New states that get to join the United States cannot have slavery. But as this new government was being created, the northern states are pushing for no more enslaved Africans to be brought in to ban that. But Georgia and South Carolina would not agree. They threatened to leave the convention. If those 2 states had delegates who left, it would cause all the work of this convention to fail, to end, and they would not have a new form of government to replace the Articles of Confederation. So, how do you compromise on this one? The northern states are saying no more enslaved people can be brought in, but southern states are saying no. If you try to do that, we are leaving. How do you find a middle ground there? How do you compromise? Well, their compromise was this. They said enslaved people could be imported for another 20 years, at which point Congress would bring up the issue again. So be careful, scholars. The compromise isn't you can do it for 20 more years and stop. The compromise is you can keep bringing in enslaved people for another 20 years, and then we're going to meet again to decide if we should stop doing that. Right? So, not stopping in 20 years, meeting in 20 years to decide if it should stop. So, quick note about that. Basically, in this compromise, it was decided that Congress would bring up the issue again in 20 years, and the Congress at that time, 20 years from now, could decide if they wanted to stop the importing of enslaved Africans or not. Well, scholars, 20 years later, Congress did bring up this topic just like they were supposed to. And at that time, they did decide to no longer allow any more importing of enslaved Africans into the United States. Now, that didn't end slavery, right? There are already enslaved people in the United States, and right, some of those are having children who are born into slavery. So it's not the end of slavery. This meeting 20 years later just ends the importing of enslaved people. Now, those three big compromises, the Great Compromise about the branches of Congress, right? How to count the enslaved people, the three-fifths compromise, and then the compromise about importing enslaved people, all finally get worked through. Compromises are made. Now, how do we make this new Constitution replace the Articles of Confederation? For the new Constitution to become the government of the United States, 9 of the 13 states would need to ratify or approve the Constitution in order for it to go into effect and be the new government. Sound easy? Well, it's not. Because there were differing views, differing positions on both the delegates at the meeting and the people of the United States. Some of those people were called Federalists. Federalists was the name given to the people who wanted to approve the new Constitution. Some of those people, James Madison, who would go on to be a president of the United States. John Jay, who would go on to be a judge on the Supreme Court of the United States, and Alexander Hamilton, right? Hamilton, many of you have been asking about when we were going to talk about him. Well, these three people lead the charge on forming the Federalist group, trying to get people to say yes to this new Constitution. But where there are Federalists, there are also some anti Federalists. And anti Federalists are people who were opposed to or against the new Constitution. And here are some reasons why. Some of them were against it because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. Remember those rights of Englishmen? Well, some people thought there should be a list of specific rights called the Bill of Rights, saying these were the rights of the citizens of the United States. And the new Constitution did not have that. Some people were against the new Constitution because they thought it gave the central government too much power, that it went from too little power to too much power. And some people were anti federalists simply because they were still angry that the Constitutional Convention had done more than what it said it was going to do. Remember way back when I said they were meeting because they said they were going to just mend or fix the Articles of Confederation? Well, They, of course, didn't do that. They scrapped it and started over. And some people did not like that it did more than they said they were going to do. Right? One of the Anti Federalists, do you recognize his picture there? That's right, Patrick Henry. Now, to help move this along and try to get people to approve or ratify the Constitution, James Madison, who goes on to be the fourth president of the United States, promised that he would work to add a Bill of Rights later if people would approve of this new Constitution. Now, later scholars, he did keep that promise and work to add a Bill of Rights, which you are seeing here. You will study those articles of the Bill of Rights in fourth grade. Now, with his promise, they were able to get all of the members, or at least, most of the members of the Constitutional Convention to sign the new Constitution. It then went to each state, and each state had to have a meeting to decide whether or not to approve of it. And finally, one by one, after that document, the Constitution was signed on September 17th of 1787 in Philadelphia. It went to each state to decide. One by one, those states started their voting, and as soon as they reached 9 yes votes from states, this would become the new government for the entire country of the United States. On March 4th of 1789, the government started operating under the new United States Constitution, which replaced the Articles of Confederation as its form of government. Scholars, 1789, over 200 years ago, this Constitution was created. This Constitution that I was just telling you about is the Constitution that still governs the United States today, over 200 years later. Wow, huh? That brings us to the end of our lesson today. Let's check on what we learned. So, we learned about the creation of a central government to replace the Articles of Confederation. That replacement, the United States Constitution. That document that starts with "We the people," in order to form a more perfect union. That document, still the governing document of the United States today. And we learned about 3 major compromises at the Constitutional Convention. If you need to back up and review any of those 3, go ahead, back this video up, listen to those again. But if you feel ready, today's assignment is to open the attached Google form, answer the questions about today's lesson. Remember, you may look back at the lesson, watch the video again, zip through it to find parts you need. But remember, at the end, click the submit button at the bottom of the form. Send those answers to your teacher. Scholars, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed these 2 lessons about the creation of the central government for the newly formed United States of America.